In the rolling hills of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, 1993, 34-year-old Ezra Miller lives as a recluse on his family's abandoned farm. Once the pride of the Amish community, Ezra turned his back on everything after losing his wife Sarah and unborn child in a tragic accident 3 years ago. His heart has grown cold, his faith shattered, and his once prosperous bakery now sits empty and forgotten. When 28-year-old Rebecca Matthews crashes her car during a fierce winter storm, she finds herself stranded and desperate. A former pastry chef from Philadelphia who lost everything after her fiancé's betrayal and her restaurant's closure, Rebecca carries her own burden of broken dreams and trust issues. With nowhere else to turn and winter closing in, she reluctantly accepts shelter from the mysterious bearded man who seems to want nothing more than to be left alone. What begins as a temporary arrangement for survival becomes something neither expected, as Rebecca's gentle touch brings warmth back to Ezra's abandoned kitchen, and her presence slowly melts the ice around his heart. Both discover that sometimes the most broken souls are exactly what each other needs to heal. But when Rebecca's past comes looking for her, and Ezra must choose between his grief and the possibility of love again, their fragile bond will be tested in ways that will determine whether two damaged hearts can truly become whole. The headlights of Rebecca Matthews' battered Honda Civic cut through the swirling snow like weak candles against the Pennsylvania darkness. Her knuckles were white against the steering wheel as she squinted through the windshield, trying to make sense of the road that seemed to disappear into nothingness every few seconds. The radio crackled with static, the last weather report she'd caught warning of the worst winter storm in decades hitting Lancaster County. "Come on, come on," she whispered to herself, her breath visible in the frigid car despite the heater running full blast. The gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, and she hadn't seen a gas station or even a house for the last 20 miles. Her cell phone lay dead on the passenger seat, its battery drained hours ago, when she desperately tried to call for help after taking what she now realized was a very wrong turn. Rebecca pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders and tried to push down the rising panic in her chest. This wasn't how her new life was supposed to start. After losing everything in Philadelphia, her restaurant, her savings, her fiancé who'd run off with her business partner and half their money, she was supposed to be driving toward hope, toward the small job she'd finally landed at a bakery in Ohio. Instead, she was lost in Amish country, with a car that was making increasingly concerning noises and a storm that seemed determined to bury her alive. The Honda shuddered violently, and Rebecca felt the terrible sensation of the wheels losing their grip on the icy road. Time slowed as the car began to slide sideways, the tail end swinging around despite her frantic attempts to correct the skid. She could do nothing but hold on as the vehicle careened off the narrow country road, crashed through a wooden fence, and came to a jarring stop against what felt like a large tree. The silence that followed was deafening. Steam hissed from under the crumpled hood, and Rebecca sat stunned for a moment, her heart hammering against her ribs. Slowly she took inventory. Her head ached, her shoulder throbbed where the seatbelt had caught her. But nothing seemed seriously injured. The same couldn't be said for her car. Even in the darkness she could see the twisted metal of the hood and the spiderweb crack across the windshield. "Perfect," she muttered, fighting back tears of frustration and fear. "Just perfect." She tried the engine, but it only responded with a grinding sound that made her wince. The headlights flickered once and died, plunging her into complete darkness. The wind howled outside, rocking the small car and making the windows rattle. Rebecca fumbled for her purse and found the small flashlight she kept in the bottom, grateful when it actually worked. Through the passenger window, the beam revealed that she'd crashed into what looked like an old oak tree in someone's front yard. Beyond it, barely visible through the driving snow, stood the dark silhouette of a large farmhouse. No lights showed in any of the windows, but it was shelter, and right now that was all that mattered. Rebecca gathered her few belongings, her purse, a small suitcase from the back seat, and the heavy coat she'd been too warm to wear while driving. The moment she opened the car door, The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and driving snow into her face like tiny needles. She fought her way around to the passenger side, retrieved her suitcase, and began the treacherous walk toward the house. Each step was a battle against the wind and the deepening snow. Her sneakers, meant for driving not hiking, filled with snow and provided almost no traction on the icy ground. Twice she fell, once dropping her flashlight and spending precious minutes feeling around in the snow to find it. By the time she reached the front porch of the farmhouse, she was soaked through, shivering uncontrollably and close to panic. The house loomed above her, 2 stories of dark wood and stone that spoke of another era. Even through the storm, she could see that the porch was well maintained, with solid wooden railings and a roof that would provide blessed shelter from the driving snow. She stumbled up the steps and practically fell against the heavy wooden door. Her first knock was weak, barely audible above the wind. She tried again, harder this time, using both fists to pound against the thick wood. "Hello," she called out, her voice nearly lost in the storm. "Please, I need help. My car crashed." Nothing. No lights appeared in the windows, no sound of movement from within. Rebecca felt despair creeping up her throat. What if the house was abandoned? What if no one lived here anymore? She pounded again, harder, more desperate. "Please, anyone! I'm stranded." Just when she was about to give up, to try to find some other shelter, or maybe attempt to walk back to her car, she heard it, the heavy sound of footsteps on wooden floors. A moment later, she could see the flicker of lamplight moving toward the door. "Who's out there?" The voice was deep, masculine, and carried a hint of an accent she couldn't quite place. More importantly, it was cautious, almost suspicious. "My name is Rebecca Matthews," she called back, pressing close to the door. "My car crashed in your yard. I'm stranded in the storm. Please, I just need to get warm and maybe use a phone." There was a long silence, and Rebecca began to worry that whoever was inside had decided to ignore her. Then she heard the sound of locks being turned, several of them, and the door opened just a crack. In the narrow gap, she could see part of a bearded face lit by the warm glow of an oil lamp, and a single dark eye studying her with obvious weariness. "You're not Amish," the voice said, and it wasn't a question. "No, I'm not," Rebecca replied, trying to keep her teeth from chattering. "I'm from Philadelphia. I was driving to Ohio and got lost in the storm. Please, I'm freezing." The eye continued to study her for what felt like an eternity. Rebecca could feel herself swaying on her feet, exhaustion and cold finally catching up with her. Just as she thought she might collapse right there on the porch, the door opened wider. The man who stood in the doorway was not what she'd expected. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore simple dark clothing, black pants, a plain white shirt, suspended. His dark hair was longish, and his full beard was neatly trimmed, but substantial. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Dark brown, almost black, and filled with a weariness that spoke of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Come in," he said simply, stepping aside. Rebecca didn't need to be asked twice. She stumbled into the house, dragging her suitcase behind her, and immediately felt the blessed relief of being out of the wind. The warmth hit her like a wall, making her realize just how close to hypothermia she might have been. The interior of the house was lit entirely by oil lamps and what looked like a fire in a large stone fireplace. The flickering light revealed a large, sparsely furnished room with wide plank wooden floors, simple furniture, and walls bare except for a few handcrafted items. It was clean, orderly, and somehow both welcoming and austere at the same time. "Thank you," she managed through chattering teeth. "Thank you so much." The man closed the door behind her and turned several locks. In the better light, she could see that he was probably in his mid-30s, with strong features and calloused hands that spoke of physical work. There was something about his manner, controlled, careful, as if he wasn't used to having visitors. "You said your car crashed?" he asked, setting the oil lamp on a nearby table. "Yes, just outside. I hit ice and slid off the road. The car won't start, and I think it's pretty badly damaged." Rebecca wrapped her arms around herself, still shivering despite the warmth of the house. "I don't suppose you have a phone I could use?" Something that might have been amusement flickered across the man's face. "No phone," he said simply. "No electricity either." Rebecca stared at him, trying to process this information. "No phone? But how do you call for help? How do you—" "We don't," he said. "At least I don't. Not anymore." There was something final in the way he said it, something that suggested a story Rebecca wasn't going to hear anytime soon. She looked around the room again, noticing details she'd missed before. The complete absence of anything electrical, the handmade quality of everything, the sense that time had somehow stopped in this place. "Are you Amish?" she asked carefully. The man was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face. "I was," he said finally. "Now I'm just here." Before Rebecca could ask what that meant, a violent shiver ran through her, strong enough to make her sway on her feet. The man seemed to notice her condition for the first time, his expression shifting from weariness to something that might have been concern. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said, his tone becoming more businesslike. "There's a room upstairs you can use. I'll get you some blankets." "I don't want to impose," Rebecca started, but he was already moving toward a narrow staircase. "You'll freeze to death if you don't get dry," he said over his shoulder. "And despite what you might think, I'm not in the habit of letting people die on my property." There was something almost bitter in the way he said it, but Rebecca was too cold and tired to analyze his tone. She followed him up the stairs, her wet shoes squelching on the wooden steps, carrying her suitcase and trying not to drip too much on his obviously well-maintained floor. The upstairs hallway was narrow and dark, lit only by the lamp he carried. He stopped at the second door on the right and pushed it open, revealing a small but clean bedroom with a simple wooden bed, a dresser, and a chair by the single window. "There are quilts in the chest at the foot of the bed," he said, setting the lamp on the dresser. "I'll bring you something hot to drink in a few minutes." "Thank you," Rebecca said, and meant it. "I'm Rebecca, by the way, Rebecca Matthews." The man paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame. For a moment she thought he wasn't going to respond. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, Ezra Miller." "Thank you, Ezra," she said softly, "for everything." He nodded once, awkwardly, and disappeared into the hallway, taking the lamp with him and leaving her in darkness. Rebecca fumbled her way to the chest and found the quilts by touch. Heavy, well-made, and blessedly dry. She quickly stripped out of her wet clothes, wrapping herself in one of the quilts, and sat on the edge of the bed to try to process what had just happened. She was alive, she was warm, and she was safe. That was what mattered. Everything else, her car, her job in Ohio, her complete lack of a plan, could wait until morning. For now, she was grateful to be sitting in a warm room instead of freezing to death in a car in the middle of nowhere. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "I have that drink," Ezra's voice said from the hallway. "Just a minute," Rebecca called back, making sure the quilt was securely wrapped around her. "Come in." He entered carrying a steaming mug and another oil lamp which he set on the dresser. The drink smelled like heaven, hot chocolate with hints of cinnamon and something else she couldn't identify. "This is wonderful," she said after taking a sip. The warmth spread through her chest, making her realize just how chilled she'd been. "Did you make this from scratch?" "My wife did," Ezra said, then stopped abruptly, his face closing off. "I mean, I used her recipe. She's not here anymore." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Rebecca felt her heart squeeze with sympathy. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "I lost someone important too recently. Not the same way, but I understand." Ezra's dark eyes met hers for a moment, and she saw something flicker there, surprise maybe, or recognition. Then the moment passed, and his expression became neutral again. "The storm should pass by morning," he said. "We'll see about your car there." "I appreciate everything you're doing," Rebecca said. I know I'm probably the last thing you wanted to deal with tonight. Something that might have been a smile ghosted across his features. You're not wrong about that, he said. But my mother would come back from the grave to haunt me if I left someone to freeze to death. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. Ezra moved toward the door, then paused. There's food in the kitchen if you get hungry. Help yourself to whatever you need. Thank you, but I'll be fine. This hot chocolate is perfect. He nodded and turned to go, then stopped again. Rebecca? Yes? Welcome to Miller Farm, he said quietly. What's left of it anyway? And with that cryptic comment, he was gone, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the sound of the wind howling outside. Rebecca finished her hot chocolate and burrowed deeper into the quilts, feeling warmer and safer than she had in months. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for tonight, she was exactly where she needed to be. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the old farmhouse, two wounded souls had found their first moment of unexpected peace. Rebecca woke to the sound of silence. After hours of listening to the wind howl against the Ingdons, the sudden quiet was almost startling. Pale morning light filtered through the simple curtains, revealing a room that looked entirely different in daylight than it had in the flickering glow of oil lamps. The walls were painted a soft cream color, and the furniture, while simple, was beautifully crafted. The quilt covering her was a masterpiece of intricate stitching in deep blues and greens, clearly made by skilled hands. Everything in the room spoke of care and attention to detail, yet there was a sadness to it too, as if it had been untouched for a long time. She stretched carefully, wincing as her muscles protested. The crash had left her more banged up than she'd realized the night before, but nothing seemed seriously injured. Her clothes from yesterday were draped over the chair, still damp but at least no longer dripping. She'd have to make do with what she had in her suitcase until they dried completely. Wrapping the quilt around herself, Rebecca padded to the window and peered outside. The sight took her breath away. Snow blanketed everything as far as she could see, transforming the world into something from a Christmas card. Her Honda was barely visible, just a dark lump under a drift of white near the old oak tree. The damage looked even worse in daylight. The entire front end was crumpled, and she could see pieces of metal scattered around the accident site. Beyond her ruined car, the farm stretched out in rolling hills and neat fence lines, all softened by the pristine snow. In the distance, she could see what looked like a barn, its red paint bright against the white landscape. Closer to the house, there were several smaller outbuildings, including one that looked like it might once have been a bakery, judging by the large windows and the brick chimney. The smell of coffee and something baking drifted up from downstairs, making her stomach growl loudly. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten, probably yesterday morning before she'd started this disastrous journey. She dressed quickly in clean clothes from her suitcase, ran her fingers through her hair in lieu of a proper brush, and made her way downstairs. The kitchen was the heart of the house. She realized immediately. It was large and warm, with a massive wood-burning stove that looked like it had been cooking meals for generations. Copper pots hung from hooks on the walls, and open shelving displayed simple white dishes and mason jars filled with what looked like preserved foods. Despite the lack of modern appliances, it was clearly a working kitchen, and someone who knew what they were doing had been cooking in it recently. Ezra stood with his back to her, tending something on the stove. In the morning light, she could see details she'd missed the night before. He was taller than she'd thought, probably close to 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical work. His dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and she could see the strong line of his jaw beneath his full beard. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, and she was struck again by his eyes, so dark they were almost black, but with a depth that suggested intelligence and pain in equal measure. "Morning," he replied simply. "Coffee, please? That smells incredible." He poured coffee into a heavy ceramic mug and handed it to her. The first sip was perfect, strong and rich, with just a hint of sweetness. "This is wonderful," she said. "Thank you." Ezra nodded toward the kitchen table, a solid wooden piece that looked like it could seat 8 people comfortably. "Sit. I made breakfast." Rebecca settled into one of the chairs, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "You didn't have to do that. I don't want to be any trouble." "It's no trouble," he said, though something in his tone suggested that having a houseguest was actually quite a lot of trouble for him. He turned back to the stove and began dishing food onto plates: scrambled eggs, thick slices of what looked like homemade bread, and strips of bacon that smelled like heaven. "This is too much," Rebecca protested, as he set a full plate in front of her. "I can't possibly eat all of this." "You need to eat," Ezra said simply, settling into the chair across from her with his own plate. "You had a rough night." The food was incredible. The eggs were creamy and perfectly seasoned. The bread was still warm and spread with what tasted like fresh butter, and the bacon was crispy and flavorful. Rebecca found herself eating with more enthusiasm than she'd had for food in months. "This is amazing," she said between bites. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Something flickered across Ezra's face. Pain, maybe, or memory. "My wife," he said quietly. "Sarah. She taught me." Rebecca set down her fork, hearing the grief in his voice. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked." "It's fine," he said, but his tone suggested it wasn't fine at all. "She's been gone 3 years now. I should be able to talk about her." "Grief doesn't follow a schedule," Rebecca said gently. "Trust me on that one." Ezra looked up at her, those dark eyes searching her face. "What did you lose?" The question was direct, almost blunt, but Rebecca found herself answering honestly. "Everything, really. My fiancé, my business, my home. Not all at once, but close enough." She took another sip of coffee, using it to wash away the bitterness that still rose in her throat when she thought about David and what he'd done. 3 months ago, I thought I had my whole life figured out. I owned a successful restaurant in Philadelphia. I was engaged to my business partner. We were talking about kids and buying a house. Then I found out he'd been stealing from the business and sleeping with our pastry chef. By the time I figured it out, he'd cleaned out our accounts and disappeared with her. "I'm sorry," Ezra said, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. "The worst part was that I had to sell the restaurant to pay the debts he'd left behind. It was my dream, you know. I'd worked for years to save up enough to open it, and he just took it all." Rebecca shook her head, trying to dispel the memories. "That's why I was driving to Ohio. I finally found a job at a bakery there. Just basic stuff. But at least it's work." "Was," Ezra corrected gently. "You said you found a job, past tense, because of the storm." Rebecca felt her heart sink as reality hit her. "Oh God, you're right. I was supposed to start today. They'll probably think I just didn't show up." She buried her face in her hands. "I don't even have a way to call them and explain." "The nearest phone is in town," Ezra said. "About 5 miles down the road." 5 miles? Rebecca looked out the kitchen window at the deep snow. "I don't suppose there's a bus or—" "No bus. No taxi either. Most folks around here have horses and buggies or trucks." He paused. "I have a truck, but the road won't be passable until the county plows come through. That could be today, could be tomorrow, depending on how backed up they are." The full reality of her situation began to sink in. She was stranded, possibly for days, with a man she didn't know. Her car was totaled, her job was probably gone, and she had maybe $300 to her name. The panic that had been lurking at the edges of her consciousness all morning began to rise. "Hey," Ezra's voice was surprisingly gentle. "Breathe." Rebecca realized she was hyperventilating and forced herself to slow down her breathing. "I'm sorry. It's just, I don't know what I'm going to do. I have nowhere to go, no money, no car." "One problem at a time," Ezra said. "First, we wait for the roads to clear. Then we'll see about getting you to town so you can make some calls. And if they won't hold my job—" Ezra was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "What kind of work did you do at your restaurant?" "Everything. Cooking, baking, managing, ordering supply. But I specialized in pastries and bread. That was my real passion." Something changed in Ezra's expression, though Rebecca couldn't quite read what it was. You're a baker. Among other things, yes. Why? Instead of answering, Ezra stood abruptly and walked to the kitchen window. He stood there for a long moment, looking out at something Rebecca couldn't see from her hurt at the table. When he turned back, his expression was carefully neutral. "There's something I should show you," he said. When you're finished eating, 20 minutes later, Rebecca found herself following Ezra through the snow toward one of the outbuildings she'd noticed from the bedroom window. He'd lent her a pair of boots that were too big but at least waterproof, and a heavy coat that smelled faintly of something masculine and comforting. The building was larger than it had appeared from the house, with a stone foundation and wooden walls that had been painted white at some point, though the paint was now faded and peeling. Large windows faced east, and the brick chimney she'd noticed earlier rose from one end of the structure. "What is this place?" Rebecca asked as Ezra fumbled with a key at the front door. "It was a bakery," he said simply. "Sarah's bakery." The door opened with a creak that spoke of disuse, and Rebecca followed him inside. Even in the dim light filtering through dirty windows, she could see that this had once been a beautiful, fully functional bakery. There were wooden work tables, glass-fronted cases for displaying goods, and along one wall, a massive brick oven that must have been original to the building. But everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, and there was a sadness to the space that made Rebecca's heart ache. This had been someone's dream, someone's passion, and it had been abandoned. "Sarah built this," Ezra said quietly, running his hand along one of the work tables. "She had dreams of selling her baked goods to the English, to non-Amish people. It was controversial in the community. Traditional Amish women don't usually run businesses like this, but she did it anyway. She was stubborn when she believed in something. There was love in his voice and pain too. She made the most incredible bread, and her pies." He trailed off, lost in memory. Rebecca walked deeper into the space, her trained eye taking in the equipment and layout. Despite the dust and neglect, she could see the potential. The brick oven alone was worth a fortune. Modern bakers paid thousands to have ovens like this built. The workspaces were well designed, and the windows would provide perfect natural light for detailed work. "What happened to it?" she asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "She died before she could really get it going. Car accident, 3 years ago. She was 8 months pregnant." Ezra's voice was flat, emotionless, but Rebecca could hear the pain underneath. "After that, I couldn't. I locked it up and haven't been back inside since." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. She could imagine Sarah in this space, young and full of dreams, planning for a future that would never come. And she could imagine Ezra's pain, walking past this building every day, seeing his wife's abandoned dreams mocking him. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "She must have been an amazing woman." She was. Ezra was standing in front of the brick oven now, his hand resting on the cold stone. "The thing is, I don't know what to do with this place. I can't bear to use it, but I can't bring myself to tear it down either." An idea was forming in Rebecca's mind, crazy and impractical and probably impossible, but growing stronger by the minute. "Ezra," she said carefully, what if someone else used it? Temporarily, I mean. Just until you decided what you really wanted to do with it." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe we could help each other. I need work and a place to stay. You have a bakery that's sitting empty. What if I got it running again? Just basic stuff at first. Bread and simple pastries. I could sell to people in town, maybe set up at farmers' markets." "You want to run Sarah's bakery?" There was something dangerous in his tone, and Rebecca realized she might have overstepped. "Not run it, exactly. More like borrow it. I'd split any profits with you, of course, and I'd only do it until I could get back on my feet. It would just be temporary." Ezra stared at her for a long moment, and Rebecca held her breath. She could see the war playing out on his face. Grief and protectiveness battling against something that might have been practical need. "I don't know," he said finally. "I'd have to think about it. Of course, I understand. It was just an idea." But as they walked back to the house through the snow, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that this abandoned bakery might be the answer to both their problems. She needed work and purpose, and Ezra needed, well, she wasn't sure what Ezra needed, but she suspected it wasn't to spend the rest of his life alone on this farm, surrounded by the ghosts of his past. The question was whether he would be brave enough to take a chance on a stranger, and whether she would be brave enough to risk her heart on a man who was clearly still in love with his dead wife. Only time would tell, but for the first time in months, Rebecca felt a spark of something that might have been hope. Back in the kitchen, Ezra made more coffee while Rebecca warmed her hands by the stove. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with possibility rather than awkwardness. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the old farmhouse, two lonely people were beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to face their futures alone. 3 days passed before the county plows finally made it down the winding road to Miller Farm. 3 days during which Rebecca and Ezra existed in a strange, careful dance around each other, polite but distant, helpful but guarded. Rebecca insisted on cooking dinner each night, partly to repay his kindness and partly because she needed something to do with her hands. Ezra chopped firewood and tended to farm chores she was only beginning to understand, disappearing for hours at a time, and returning with snow on his boots, and that same carefully neutral expression. They didn't talk about the bakery again, though Rebecca caught him looking at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, as if he was trying to solve some complicated puzzle. She didn't push. She'd learned enough about grief to know that it couldn't be rushed, and she sensed that Ezra Miller was a man who needed time to work through his thoughts before he could share them. On the morning the plows finally came through, Rebecca stood at the kitchen window watching the orange truck scrape its way down the road, its blade pushing walls of snow to either side. Freedom, she thought, though the word felt oddly hollow. She could leave now, could walk the 5 miles to town and call about her job, could figure out her next move. So why did she feel more anxious than relieved? "Road's clear," Ezra said behind her, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway, truck keys in his hand. "I can drive you to town whenever you're ready." "Thank you," Rebecca said, though neither of them moved. "I should probably go soon. Make those phone calls." "Probably," he agreed, but he didn't sound any more enthusiastic about it than she felt. They stood there for a moment in the warm kitchen, the morning light streaming through the windows and highlighting the careful distance they'd maintained between them. Then Ezra cleared his throat and looked down at the keys in his hand. "Before we go," he said slowly, "there's something I want to ask you." Rebecca's heart jumped, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "What's that?" "The bakery idea. I've been thinking about it." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Would you show me what you meant about getting it running again?" Rebecca felt a surge of hope, so strong it almost made her dizzy. "You mean you're considering it?" "I'm considering letting you try." "There's a Ezra's tone was cautious, but there was something else there too. Curiosity, maybe, or the faint stirring of interest. But I'd want to see what you had in mind first." "Of course. Absolutely." Rebecca was already reaching for her coat. "We could go look at it now, if you want. I could walk you through what I was thinking." 20 minutes later they were back in the dusty bakery, but this time Rebecca had come prepared with a notebook and the measuring tape she'd found in one of Ezra's kitchen drawers. She moved through the space with professional efficiency, noting measurements, checking the condition of equipment, making lists of what would need to be cleaned, repaired, or replaced. "The brick oven is the real treasure here," she said, running her hands over the stone surface. "These old ovens hold heat better than anything modern. Once it's properly heated, you can bake bread all day just from the residual warmth." Ezra watched her work, his expression unreadable. "What would you need to get it running?" Rebecca consulted her notes. "Honestly, not much to start with. A thorough cleaning, some basic supplies, flour, yeast, salt, sugar. Maybe some new mixing bowls and measuring cups. Most of the big equipment is here and looks like it's in good shape under all the dust. How much would that cost? Maybe $300 to get started with the basics. I could keep it simple at first, just bread and maybe some muffins or basic pastries. Test the market, see if there's demand. Rebecca paused, studying his face. Ezra, are you really thinking about this? Instead of answering directly, he walked over to one of the work tables and brushed away some of the dust with his hand. Sarah used to talk about selling her bread at the farmer's market in town. She thought the English would pay good money for authentic, Amish-style baking. She was probably right. People love artisanal bread, especially if it's made the traditional way. She never got the chance to find out. Ezra's voice was quiet, and Rebecca could hear the old pain in it. After she died, I thought maybe it was punishment, you know, for wanting too much, for not being satisfied with the traditional ways. Rebecca felt her heart break a little for him. Ezra, no. Accidents happen. They're not punishment for dreams. He looked up at her, and for a moment his careful mask slipped, revealing the depths of guilt and grief he'd been carrying. How do you know? Because I've spent the last 3 months blaming myself for what David did to me, Rebecca said softly, wondering if I was too trusting, too naive, if I somehow deserved it. But the truth is, sometimes bad things just happen. It doesn't mean we weren't worthy of our dreams. They stood there in the dusty silence, two wounded people recognizing the pain in each other. Then Ezra straightened his shoulders and seemed to come to some internal decision. $300, he said. That's what you'd need. To start, yes. And you'd split any profits. 50-50, absolutely. And I'd keep careful records of everything. Expenses, sales, complete transparency. Ezra nodded slowly, then walked to one of the windows and looked out at the snow-covered yard. Rebecca held her breath, afraid to say anything that might tip the scales the wrong way. There are conditions, he said finally, not turning around. Name them. First, this is temporary. If it doesn't work out, or if I change my mind, you leave. No arguments, no guilt trips. Understood. Second, you don't change anything about the space without asking me first. Don't move equipment, don't paint walls, don't make it yours. It's still Sarah's bakery. That one stung a little, but Rebecca understood. Agreed. Third, you stay out of my way. I don't want to have to worry about making conversation or being social. You do your work, I do mine. Fine by me. Ezra turned around then, and Rebecca was surprised to see something that might have been relief in his dark eyes. Then we have a deal. Rebecca felt like she might cry from sheer gratitude. Thank you, Ezra. You won't regret this, I promise. I already regret it, he said, but there was the faintest hint of humor in his voice. The question is whether I'll regret it more or less as time goes on. They shook hands on it right there in the dusty bakery, and Rebecca felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in months. Excitement about the future. She had work, she had purpose, and she had a chance to prove that she could build something good from the ruins of her old life. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Ezra drove her to town to make her phone calls, and as she'd feared, the bakery in Ohio had already given her position to someone else. But instead of despair, she felt only a mild disappointment. She had something better now, a real opportunity to build something of her own, even if it was temporary. They stopped at the general store for supplies, where Rebecca met Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who ran the place. Word traveled fast in small towns, and it seemed everyone already knew about the English girl staying at Miller Farm. Mrs. Henderson was kind, but curious, asking pointed questions about Rebecca's plans and how long she intended to stay. Not long, Rebecca had answered honestly, just until I get back on my feet. But as they drove back to the farm with the truck bed full of flour sacks and baking supplies, Rebecca found herself wondering if that was really true. There was something about this place, the rolling hills, the peaceful quiet, the sense of being removed from the frantic pace of city life that appealed to her in ways she hadn't expected. And then there was Ezra himself. Beneath his gruff exterior and careful emotional walls, she sensed a depth and gentleness that intrigued her. There was nothing like David, who had been charming and smooth-talking and ultimately hollow. Ezra was solid, reliable, authentic in a way that felt rare in her experience. Not that it mattered, she reminded herself firmly. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. She was here to work, save money, and figure out her next move. Getting romantically involved with her landlord, especially one who was clearly still grieving his dead wife, would be a disaster of epic proportions. The bakery took 3 full days to clean properly. Rebecca scrubbed every surface, washed every piece of equipment, and swept and mopped until the floors gleamed. Ezra helped more than she'd expected, though he maintained his careful emotional distance. He fixed a broken shelf, replaced some worn-out mixing bowls, and even helped her test the big brick oven to make sure it was safe to use. Sarah would have loved seeing this place clean again, he said on the evening of the 3rd day, standing in the doorway and looking around at their work. "Tell me about her," Rebecca said impulsively, then immediately regretted it when she saw his face close off. "I'd rather not. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, then seemed to relent slightly. She was bright, full of energy and plans. She could see possibilities where other people only saw problems. He paused. "A lot like you, actually." Rebecca felt her cheeks warm at the comparison. "She sounds wonderful." She was. Ezra turned away. "I should let you get back to work." The next morning Rebecca woke before dawn with nervous energy coursing through her veins. Today was the day she would bake her first loaves in Sarah's kitchen, and despite her confidence, she was terrified of failing. What if the oven didn't work properly? What if her bread didn't rise? What if she'd overestimated her abilities after months away from professional baking? She dressed quickly and made her way to the bakery in the pre-dawn darkness, using a flashlight to navigate the snowy path. The building was cold and dark, but it felt different now that it was clean and ready for use. It felt alive again, full of potential. Rebecca started by lighting the brick oven, a process that took patience and skill. She built a small fire in the center of the oven floor, gradually adding more wood until the entire interior glowed white-hot. While the oven heated, she mixed her first batch of dough, a simple white bread recipe that she could make in her sleep. As she worked, kneading the dough with practiced hands, she felt some of her anxiety fade away. This was what she was meant to do. This was where she belonged, in a kitchen, creating something nourishing and beautiful from the simplest ingredients. By the time the sun rose, the bakery was filled with warmth and the rich aroma of baking bread. Rebecca had 6 loaves in the oven and 2 more batches of dough rising on the work tables. She felt like herself again for the first time in months. She was just pulling the first batch from the oven when she heard footsteps on the front porch. The door opened, and Ezra stepped inside, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her one of the cups. "Thank you." Rebecca accepted the coffee gratefully, suddenly aware of how early she'd started. "I hope I didn't wake you. I've been up for an hour." I could smell the bread from the house. Ezra looked around the bakery, taking in the sight of fresh loaves cooling on racks and dough rising under clean towels. "It smells like it used to," he said quietly, "when Sarah was here." Rebecca studied his face, trying to read his expression. "Is that good or bad?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, staring at the loaves of golden bread. "I'm not sure yet," he said finally, "but it's something." They stood there in the warm bakery, drinking coffee and breathing in the scent of fresh bread, and Rebecca felt something shift between them. The careful distance was still there, but there was something else now too, a shared understanding, maybe, or the beginning of trust. "The bread looks good," Ezra said. "It should. I've been making this recipe for 15 years. Rebecca cut into one of the cooled loaves, revealing a perfect crumb structure and releasing another wave of that heavenly aroma. Want to try some? She cut 2 thick slices and handed one to Ezra, watching his face as he took his first bite. His eyes widened slightly, and something that might have been pleasure crossed his features. "This is excellent," he said, and she could hear the surprise in his voice. "You sound shocked. I guess I wasn't sure what to expect. It's been a long time since there was fresh bread in this place." "Well, you'd better get used to it," Rebecca said, feeling a surge of confidence. "I plan to fill this place with fresh bread every day." As she spoke, she realized with a start that she meant it. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement anymore, at least not in her heart. This was her bakery now, her chance to build something meaningful, and if Ezra Miller came as part of the package, well, that was a complication she'd just have to figure out how to handle. Outside, the winter sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the snow-covered fields and promising the possibility of spring. Inside the old bakery, 2 wounded souls shared fresh bread and tentative hope, neither quite ready to admit that maybe, just maybe, they were exactly what each other needed. 2 weeks into February, Rebecca's bread had become the talk of Lancaster County. What started as 6 loaves a day had grown to 20, then 40, as word spread through the community about the exceptional quality coming out of the old Miller bakery. Miss Henderson could barely keep the shelves stocked at her general store, and Rebecca had started taking special orders from restaurants in nearby towns. The success should have made her purely happy, but instead she found herself caught in an emotional tug-of-war she hadn't expected. Every morning when she walked to the bakery in the pre-dawn darkness, she felt a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing from her life for months. Every evening when she counted the day's earnings and split them carefully into 2 piles, her half and Ezra's half, she felt pride in what they were building together. But there was something else growing alongside the business success, something that both thrilled and terrified her. She was falling for Ezra Miller, and she had no idea what to do about it. It had started small, appreciation for the way he'd quietly fixed the bakery's front step without being asked, gratitude for the thermos of hot coffee he brought her each morning, curiosity about the man who could be so gentle with injured animals, but so guarded with his own heart. But somehow, over the past 2 weeks, those feelings had deepened into something much more dangerous. She loved the way he listened when she talked, really listened, as if her words mattered. She loved his dry sense of humor, which appeared more frequently as he grew comfortable with her presence. She loved watching him work with his hands, repairing fence posts, splitting firewood, tending to the small flock of chickens he kept behind the barn. There was something deeply attractive about a man who could create and fix things, who lived so connected to the rhythms of the natural world. Most of all, she loved the moments when his careful emotional walls would slip, revealing glimpses of the passionate, loving man he'd been before grief had frozen his heart. Like the evening she'd found him in the barn, gently caring for a cat that had given birth to kittens in one of the empty stalls. "I should probably find them homes," he'd said, but his voice had been soft as he watched the tiny creatures nursing. "They're beautiful," Rebecca had replied, kneeling beside him to get a better look. "What will you name them?" "I don't name barn cats," Ezra had said firmly. "They're working animals, not pets." But the next morning, she'd overheard him talking to the mother cat, calling her Rosie and promising her extra milk if she kept the mice out of the grain storage. When he'd caught Rebecca smiling at him, he'd turned red and muttered something about practical farm management, but she'd seen the tenderness in his eyes. The problem was that Sarah's presence still filled the farmhouse like a ghost. Her recipes were the ones Ezra used when he cooked. Her quilts covered the beds. Her portrait, a simple sketch Ezra had drawn, sat on the mantelpiece, showing a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Rebecca felt like an intruder in Sarah's world, and she suspected Ezra felt guilty for every moment of happiness or connection he shared with another woman. The situation came to a head on a particularly busy Thursday morning. Rebecca had been up since 3 o'clock, trying to keep up with a large order from a restaurant in Lancaster, when disaster struck. She was pulling a batch of sourdough loaves from the brick oven when one of the heavy stones shifted, and her hand caught the edge of the red-hot surface. The pain was immediate and excruciating. Rebecca cried out, dropping the bread peel and clutching her burned hand to her chest. The smell of singed flesh filled the air, and she felt tears of pain and frustration spring to her eyes. "Rebecca," Ezra's voice came from the doorway, sharp with concern. "What happened?" "Burned my hand on the oven," she managed through gritted teeth. "It's not too bad." But when she looked down at her hand, she could see that it was worse than she'd thought. The burn ran along the edge of her palm, and 3 fingers, already blistering and angry red. "Let me see," Ezra said, moving quickly to her side. "It's fine, really. I just need to run some cold water on it." "Rebecca," his voice was gentle but firm. "Let me see." Something in his tone made her stop protesting. She held out her injured hand, and Ezra took it carefully in both of his, examining the burn with practiced eyes. "You need to get this looked at," he said. "This is a serious burn." "I can't afford a doctor visit," Rebecca said, automatically. "I'll be fine. I've dealt with kitchen burns before. Not like this one." Ezra was already reaching for his coat. "Come on. I'm taking you to the clinic in town." "Ezra, no. I have 6 more loaves in the oven, and Mrs. Henderson is expecting." "I'll handle the bread," he said firmly. "Your health is more important than a few loaves." The gentleness in his voice, combined with the way he was still holding her uninjured hand, made something break open in Rebecca's chest. Here was this man who claimed he wanted to be left alone, who insisted their arrangement was purely business, and he was ready to drop everything to take care of her. "Why?" she whispered. "Why what? Why do you care? You've made it clear this is just a business arrangement. Why does it matter if I'm hurt?" Ezra's dark eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something raw and vulnerable there. "Because," he said quietly, "I can't watch someone else get hurt when I could have prevented it." The drive to the clinic was quiet except for Rebecca's occasional gasps of pain when the truck hit a bump. Ezra drove with careful attention to the road, but she caught him glancing at her frequently, worry clear on his face. Dr. Martinez, a kind, middle-aged woman who'd been serving the rural community for 20 years, examined Rebecca's hand with professional thoroughness. "Second-degree burns," she announced. "Not severe enough for hospitalization, but they need proper care. I'm going to clean and bandage them, give you something for the pain, and you'll need to keep them dry and change the dressing daily." "Will I be able to use my hand normally?" Rebecca asked, trying not to think about what this might mean for her baking. "In a few weeks, yes, but you need to keep it protected until it heals. No heavy lifting, no exposure to heat, and definitely no more brick ovens for a while." Rebecca felt her heart sink. Without the use of her dominant hand, she couldn't possibly keep up with the bakery's demand. All the progress they'd made, all the customers they'd built up, would be lost. "How long is a while?" she asked. "At least 2 weeks, possibly 3. Burns like this take time to heal properly." On the drive back to the farm, Rebecca stared out the window at the snow-covered fields and tried not to cry. Everything had been going so well. For the first time since Betty's betrayal, she'd felt like she was building something meaningful, creating a life she could be proud of. Now it was all going to fall apart because of one careless moment. "It'll be okay," Ezra said quietly, as if he could read her thoughts. "No, it won't. I'll lose all my customers. Mrs. Henderson will find another supplier, and the restaurants will move on to someone more reliable. By the time my hand heals, there won't be a business left to come back to. You don't know that. I do know that. I've seen how quickly people move on when you can't deliver." Rebecca's voice was bitter with experience. "David taught me that lesson very well." Ezra was quiet for a moment, then said something that completely surprised her. "What if you didn't have to stop baking?" "What do you mean? What if someone helped you? Someone who could handle the physical parts while you directed?" Rebecca stared at him. Are you offering to help me bake? I'm offering to learn. The idea was so unexpected that Rebecca didn't know how to respond. Ezra, you don't understand. Commercial baking isn't like cooking at home. It requires precision, timing, experience. It's not something you can just pick up. Sarah used to say the same thing when I tried to help her in the kitchen, Ezra said with a slight smile. But she also said I was a quick learner when I put my mind to it. Rebecca felt a flutter of hope, quickly followed by doubt. Even if you could learn the basics, people are buying my bread. They're expecting a certain quality. If the product changes, they'll notice. Then we make sure it doesn't change. You teach me to do exactly what you do, the way you do it. I'll be your hands until yours heal. The offer was generous beyond anything Rebecca had expected, and it came with implications that both excited and terrified her. Working so closely together, spending hours side by side in the warm bakery, would destroy the careful distance they'd maintained. But what choice did she have? Why would you do this? She asked. You could just end our arrangement now. Tell me the deal is off. You'd still have your share of what we've made so far. Ezra pulled the truck into the farmyard and turned off the engine. For a long moment, he sat staring out the windshield at the bakery building. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet Rebecca had to strain to hear it. Because for the first time in 3 years, I wake up in the morning with something to look forward to. Because that building isn't just an empty monument to my grief anymore. Because you've brought life back to this place, and I'm not ready to let that go. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they weren't from pain or frustration. Don't read too much into it, he said quickly, his walls going back up. It's still a business arrangement. I just think it's a good business, and I don't want to see it fail because of bad luck. But Rebecca had heard what was underneath his words, and she suspected he had too. This wasn't just about business anymore, for either of them. That afternoon, despite the doctor's orders to rest, Rebecca found herself back in the bakery with Ezra, watching him attempt his first loaf of bread. It was, she had to admit, a disaster. He added too much flour, didn't knead long enough, and somehow managed to get dough stuck to every surface in the kitchen. This is hopeless, he said, staring at the lumpy, misshapen mass that was supposed to be rising dough. No, it's not, Rebecca said firmly, trying not to laugh at the frustrated expression on his flour-dusted face. You just need practice, and maybe a little less flour next time. How much is a little less? Here, let me show you. Rebecca moved to stand beside him at the work table, close enough that she could guide his hands with her uninjured one. Feel the dough. It should be smooth and elastic, like this. As she placed her hand over his, helping him work the dough properly, she became intensely aware of his closeness. She could smell his scent, clean soap and something masculine that made her pulse quicken. When he turned his head to ask a question, his face was only inches from hers, and she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Like this? He asked, and his voice was slightly rough. Yes, she whispered, exactly like that. For a moment they stood frozen, hands moving together in the rhythm of kneading, eyes locked, the air between them charged with possibility. Then Ezra cleared his throat and stepped back, breaking the spell. I think I've got it now, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Good, Rebecca managed, her cheeks burning. That's good. But as they worked through the rest of the afternoon, teaching him the basics of bread making, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained was crumbling, and she wasn't sure either of them had the strength to rebuild it. That evening, as they sat at the kitchen table dividing the day's smaller than usual earnings, Ezra surprised her again. Rebecca, he said, not looking up from the money he was counting, about earlier in the bakery. What about it? I want you to know that I'm grateful for what you've done here, for bringing the bakery back to life, for, he paused, seeming to search for words, for reminding me that life doesn't have to stop just because someone you love dies. Rebecca felt her heart squeeze. Ezra, but I also want you to know that I'm not ready for for whatever this is becoming between us. I don't know if I'll ever be ready." His honesty was both painful and admirable. "I understand," Rebecca said quietly, "and I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, but I want you to know that what you're doing, helping me, teaching yourself to bake, keeping the business going, it means everything to me, whether it leads somewhere or not." Ezra finally looked up at her, and she was surprised to see something like relief in his eyes. "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for being honest." They finished dividing the money in comfortable silence, but Rebecca could feel the weight of unspoken feelings hanging between them. She was falling in love with a man who wasn't ready to love her back, who might never be ready. It should have been heartbreaking, but instead she found herself filled with a patient hope she hadn't known she possessed. Some things she was learning were worth waiting for, and if Ezra Miller needed time to heal before he could open his heart again, then she would give him that time. She had nowhere else to be, nothing else to do, but tend her growing feelings like the delicate shoots of a garden in early spring. Outside, the February wind howled around the old farmhouse, but inside, two wounded hearts continued their slow, careful dance toward something that might someday become love. The third week of March brought an unseasonably warm spell that melted the snow into rushing streams and filled the air with the promise of spring. Rebecca's hand had healed enough for her to take over most of the baking again, though Ezra continued to help with the heavier tasks. Their partnership had evolved into something seamless and beautiful. She would start the dough, he would tend the oven, she would shape the loaves, he would handle the loading and timing. They moved around each other in the bakery like dancers who had been practicing together for years. The success of their collaboration was evident in more than just the quality of their bread. Orders had increased again, and Rebecca had started experimenting with new recipes: cinnamon rolls that sold out every morning, herb focaccia that restaurants couldn't get enough of, and a sourdough that had people driving from 3 counties away. But more important than the business success was the easy rhythm they'd found together, the comfortable silences punctuated by shared laughter, the way Ezra had begun to smile more often. Rebecca was just pulling a batch of dinner rolls from the oven when she heard an unfamiliar car pull into the yard. Through the bakery window, she watched a sleek black sedan navigate carefully around the muddy patches left by the melting snow. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the man who stepped out of the driver's seat. David, her ex-fiancé, as handsome and charming as ever in his expensive suit and perfect smile. What was he doing here? How had he even found her? Rebecca's hands shook as she set down the bread pans. She hadn't seen or spoken to David since the day she'd discovered his betrayal, the day her entire world had collapsed. The sight of him now, in this place that had become her sanctuary, felt like a violation. The bakery door opened, and David stepped inside, his calculating eyes taking in the rustic space, with barely concealed disdain. "Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of assumed intimacy, "you're a hard woman to find." "What are you doing here, David?" Rebecca's voice was steadier than she felt. "How did you find me? I hired a private investigator. Did you really think you could disappear without a trace?" David's smile was as smooth as ever, but there was something cold underneath it. "We need to talk. We have nothing to talk about. You made that clear when you stole my money and ran off with Jessica. That's actually what I want to discuss." David moved closer, and Rebecca instinctively stepped back. "Things didn't work out with Jessica, and I've been doing a lot of thinking. I made mistakes, Rebecca. Big ones, but I want to make it right." Before Rebecca could respond, the bakery door opened again, and Ezra walked in carrying a load of split wood for the oven. He stopped short when he saw David, his dark eyes immediately assessing the situation. "Everything all right?" Ezra asked quietly, but Rebecca could hear the protective edge in his voice. David's gaze flicked between Rebecca and Ezra, taking in the flour on both their aprons, the easy familiarity of their positioning, the way Ezra had automatically moved closer to Rebecca's side. His smile became sharp. "I see," David said. "So this is what you've been up to. Playing house with a farmer." The contempt in his voice was obvious. "This is Ezra Miller," Rebecca said, lifting her chin. "He's my business partner. Ezra, this is David Garrison, my former fiancé." "Former is right," Ezra said, his tone carefully neutral but his posture protective. "Nice to meet you." David didn't acknowledge the introduction. Instead, he focused entirely on Rebecca. "Business partner. Rebecca, darling, what are you doing? This whole quaint bakery thing is charming, but it's time to come home. I have a proposition that will get us both back on our feet." "I am on my feet," Rebecca said firmly. "And I'm home. In the middle of nowhere, baking bread for farmers." David laughed, the sound harsh in the warm bakery. "Rebecca, you're better than this. We're better than this. I've got backing for a new restaurant, bigger and better than what we had before. 5-star dining, celebrity chef status, everything we always dreamed of." "Everything you dreamed of," Rebecca corrected. "And I notice I have backing. Not we have backing." "What's the catch, David?" "No catch. I need an executive chef I can trust, someone with your skills and creativity. We could be partners again, in every sense of the word." His voice dropped to the intimate tone that had once made her heart race. Now it just made her feel sick. "I know I hurt you, baby. I know I broke your trust. But people make mistakes. That doesn't mean we throw away everything good we had together." Rebecca felt a familiar wave of self-doubt wash over her. This was David's greatest talent, making her question her own perceptions, her own worth, her own decision. For 3 years he'd been the voice in her head telling her she wasn't good enough, smart enough, strong enough to make it on her own. Even after his betrayal, that voice had lingered. But then she felt Ezra's presence beside her, steady and warm, and remembered who she'd become over the past 2 months. She'd built something here, something good and honest and entirely her own. She'd learned to trust herself again, to believe in her own instincts and abilities. She wasn't the same broken woman who'd fled Philadelphia in a snowstorm. "No," she said quietly. "No?" David's confident expression faltered slightly. "No, I won't go with you. No, I don't want to be your partner. No, I don't believe you've changed." Rebecca's voice grew stronger with each word. "You didn't come here to apologize or make amends, David. You came here because your new venture needs my skills and you think I'm desperate enough to accept anything you offer. That's not true. It is true. You haven't asked how I've been, whether I'm happy, what I've built here. You've only talked about what you want and what you need." Rebecca stepped forward, no longer intimidated by his presence. "I don't need you, David. I don't need your restaurant, your backing, or your empty promises. I have something better here." David's mask of charm finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation underneath. "Better? Rebecca, look around. This is a barn in the middle of nowhere. You're wasting your talent, making bread for yokels. In 5 years, what will you have to show for it? A few $100s in the bank and cold hands. I'll have self-respect," Rebecca said simply. "I'll have work that matters, customers who appreciate what I do, and friends who actually care about me as a person. That's worth more than all the 5-star restaurants in the world." David's gaze flicked to Ezra again, and his expression turned ugly. "Friends? Is that what we're calling it? Rebecca, you always were naive, but this is pathetic even for you. Do you really think this Amish farmer cares about you? You're probably just a convenient piece of—" He never finished the sentence because Ezra moved with surprising speed, grabbing David by the lapels of his expensive suit and pressing him back against the wall. "Watch your mouth," Ezra said quietly, but there was danger in his voice that made David's eyes widen. "Show some respect or get out." "Ezra, don't," Rebecca said, touching his arm gently. "He's not worth it." Ezra looked at her for a moment, then released David with obvious reluctance. "You heard the lady. Time for you to leave." David straightened his suit, trying to regain his composure, but Rebecca could see the fear in his eyes. He'd never been good at handling situations where his charm and manipulation didn't work. "This isn't over, Rebecca," he said, moving toward the door. "When you get tired of playing pioneer woman, When reality sets in and you realize you're wasting your life in this backwater, you know where to find me. Don't hold your breath, Rebecca replied. David paused in the doorway, making one last attempt at emotional manipulation. I loved you, Rebecca. I still do. That has to count for something. No, she said, and her voice was steady as stone. It doesn't. Love isn't just words, David. It's actions, choices, sacrifice. It's showing up every day and putting someone else's happiness alongside your own. You never loved me. You loved what I could do for you. David's face twisted with anger and frustration. Without another word, he stalked out of the bakery, leaving the door open behind him. A few moments later, they heard his car start and drive away, the sound fading into the distance. Rebecca stood in the sudden silence, her heart pounding and her hands shaking with residual adrenaline. She'd done it. She'd faced David down and chosen her own path, without wavering. It should have felt triumphant, but instead she felt drained and strangely sad. You okay? Ezra asked gently. Rebecca nodded, then shook her head, then laughed shakily. I don't know. That was harder than I expected. He's a piece of work, Ezra said, his jaw still tight with anger. What he said about you, about this place. He's wrong, Rebecca said firmly. About all of it. This isn't wasting my life. This is the first time in years that I've felt like I'm living my real life. Ezra studied her face carefully. Are you sure? He made some valid points about opportunities, about your career. Ezra Miller, Rebecca said, turning to face him fully. Are you actually suggesting I should have gone with him? I'm suggesting that you shouldn't make decisions based on whatever this is between us. If staying here means limiting your future, Rebecca felt her heart crack a little. Even now, after everything they'd shared, Ezra was still trying to push her away, still convinced that he had nothing valuable to offer. What if I told you that staying here isn't about you? She said quietly. What if I told you that I've found something in this place, in this work, that I never had before? What if I told you that for the first time in my life I wake up every morning excited about the day ahead, and it has nothing to do with impressing anyone or proving anything to anyone else? Ezra was quiet for a long moment. Is that true? It's true? David offered me everything I thought I wanted 3 months ago. Status, success, financial security. But I don't want those things anymore, at least not the way he was offering them. I want to build something real, something that matters. I want to make bread that nourishes people, not just impresses critics. I want to be part of a community instead of just using people to climb some imaginary ladder. And if I wasn't here? Ezra asked. If this was just about the bakery and the work? Rebecca's heart hammered as she realized this was her moment of truth. She could lie, could protect herself by claiming it was only about the business, or she could be brave enough to tell him how she really felt. If you weren't here, I'd still stay, she said honestly, because I love this work and this place. But Ezra, you are here, and that makes everything better. You make everything better. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge she'd just built, waiting to see if he would cross it or burn it down. Ezra stared at her for what felt like an eternity, his dark eyes searching her face. When he spoke, his voice was rough, with emotion. Rebecca, I'm not ready to. I know, she said gently. I'm not asking you to be ready. I'm not asking for promises or declarations or anything you're not prepared to give. I'm just telling you the truth about how I feel. The truth is complicated, Ezra said, running his hands through his hair. The truth is that I care about you more than I should, more than I ever thought I'd care about anyone again. But I also know that Sarah will always be part of me, and I don't know if that's fair to you. Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief and hope, and something that felt dangerously close to joy. Ezra, she said softly, I would never ask you to forget Sarah or pretend she didn't matter. She's part of your story, part of what makes you the man I love. She caught herself just in time. The man I care about. I don't want to replace her. I just want to see if there's room in your heart for something new alongside the love you'll always have for her. Ezra closed his eyes, and when he opened them, Rebecca saw something she'd never seen there before. Hope, fragile and tentative, but real. I don't know how to do this, he said quietly. I don't know how to love someone new without feeling like I'm betraying her memory. Then we figure it out together, Rebecca said, taking a step closer to him. No pressure, no timelines, no expectations. Just honesty and patience, and seeing where this goes. For a moment they stood there in the warm bakery, surrounded by the scent of fresh bread and the golden light of the late afternoon sun. Then, slowly, carefully, Ezra reached out and took her hand. Not her injured hand, but her strong one, the one that had been kneading dough and shaping loaves and building a new life. Together, he said quietly, and it sounded like a promise. Outside, the first robins of spring were singing in the oak tree where Rebecca's car had crashed 2 months ago. Inside the bakery, 2 wounded hearts took their first tentative steps towards something that might, with time and patience and grace, become the kind of love that heals rather than hurts, that builds rather than destroys, that honors the past while embracing the future. 6 weeks later, the Miller Farm Bakery was hosting its first community celebration, a spring festival that had grown from Rebecca's simple idea to thank their loyal customers into something the entire county was talking about. Tables laden with fresh bread, pastries, and local honey stretched across the front yard, while children ran between the adults and the sound of laughter filled the air. Rebecca stood on the bakery's front porch, watching Ezra demonstrate the brick oven to a group of fascinated visitors. He'd changed so much over the past month and a half, not just in his willingness to be social, but in the way he carried himself, the way genuine smiles came easier to his face. The careful walls he'd built around his heart were still there, but they had windows now, places where light could get in. Their relationship had evolved slowly, carefully, like seedlings pushing through the last of winter's frozen ground. There had been no dramatic declarations, no passionate kisses in the moonlight. Instead, there had been quiet conversations over morning coffee, hands that brushed while kneading dough, glances that lingered just a moment longer than necessary. Ezra was learning to trust his heart again, and Rebecca was learning that the best kind of love was worth waiting for. "Rebecca," Mrs. Henderson's voice called out from the crowd. "Come over here, dear. I want you to meet someone." Rebecca made her way through the crowd to where Mrs. Henderson stood with a distinguished-looking older man in a neat suit. "Rebecca Matthews, this is Thomas Whitman, from the Pennsylvania Artisan Food Council," Mrs. Henderson said, beaming with pride. "He's driven all the way from Harrisburg to try your bread." "Miss Matthews," Thomas said, shaking her hand warmly. "I've been hearing remarkable things about your bakery. Word has traveled all the way to the state capital about the quality of bread coming out of Lancaster County." "That's very kind," Rebecca said, feeling suddenly nervous. "I hope it lives up to the reputation." "Oh, it does more than that," Thomas said, taking a bite of the sourdough he'd been sampling. "This is exceptional work. Tell me, have you ever considered expanding? There's a growing market for authentic artisanal bread in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, even New York." Rebecca felt a familiar flutter of old ambitions, but this time it was tempered by something else, contentment with what she'd already built. "I appreciate the interest, but I'm happy with the scale we're at now. This isn't just a business for me, it's a way of life." Thomas looked surprised but impressed. "That's refreshing to hear. Most artisans I meet are eager to scale up as quickly as possible. But there's something to be said for keeping things personal, for maintaining that connection to community." He handed her his card. "If you ever change your mind, give me a call. The state would be proud to support what you're doing here." As Thomas wandered off to try the cinnamon rolls, Rebecca found herself thinking about paths not taken and choices that had led her exactly where she needed to be. A year ago, an offer like that would have sent her into a tailspin of excitement and planning. Now, she felt only a quiet satisfaction in knowing that success could take many forms. Everything all right? Ezra's voice came from behind her, warm with the easy affection that had developed between them. Perfect, she said, turning to smile at him. Just thinking about how much has changed. Good changes, the best changes. They stood together watching the festival, comfortable in each other's presence in a way that still amazed Rebecca. This was what she'd been looking for all her life without knowing it, not passion that burned hot and fast, but something steady and deep and true. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd began to thin, Rebecca found herself helping to clean up while Ezra loaded leftover bread into baskets to distribute to elderly neighbors. It was nearly sunset when the last guest finally departed, leaving them alone in the golden light of early evening. "I can't believe how well that went," Rebecca said, sinking into one of the chairs they'd set up on the porch. "Did you see how many people asked about placing regular orders?" "I saw," Ezra said, settling into the chair beside her. "I also saw Thomas Whitman talking to you. What did he want?" "To offer me the chance to expand statewide, maybe beyond." Rebecca watched Ezra's face carefully, looking for any sign of the old withdrawal, the old fear of her leaving. Instead, she saw only curiosity and what looked like pride. "What did you tell him?" "That I'm happy where I am." "Are you?" "Really?" Ezra's dark eyes searched her face. "Because I'd understand if you wanted more. You're talented enough for anything, Rebecca. You shouldn't limit yourself because of this." Rebecca felt her heart squeeze at the lingering insecurity in his voice, the way he still sometimes spoke, as if he were holding her back rather than building her up. "Ezra Miller," she said firmly, "look at me." He did, those beautiful dark eyes focusing on her face with complete attention. "I didn't turn down that offer because I'm settling or limiting myself. I turned it down because I found something here that I never had before. Work that feeds my soul, a community that values what I do, and," she paused, gathering her courage, "and a man I love more than I ever thought possible." The words hung in the air between them, simple and honest and true. It was the first time she'd said them out loud, though she'd felt them growing stronger every day for weeks. Ezra went very still, and for a moment Rebecca worried. She'd pushed too hard, too fast. Then he reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "This morning when I was getting ready for the festival, I went to put on my good shirt, the one Sarah always said made my eyes look nice. And for the first time in 3 years, I thought about what you would think of it instead of what she would have thought." Ezra's voice was rough, with emotion. "It scared me at first, feeling like I was letting her go, but then I realized I wasn't letting her go. I was making room for you alongside her." Tears pricked Rebecca's eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. "I've been carrying so much guilt," Ezra continued. "Guilt about surviving when she didn't, guilt about the business failing after she died, guilt about being happy again. But watching you today, seeing how proud you are of what we've built together, I realized Sarah would have loved you. She would have loved your strength, your kindness, your refusal to give up on your dreams. And she would have wanted me to be happy." "Ezra," Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. "I love you, Rebecca Matthews," he said, and his voice was strong and sure. "I love your determination and your gentleness and the way you make everything around you better. I love the way you've brought this place back to life, brought me back to life. And I'm done being afraid of that." Rebecca felt tears spill over her cheeks as 3 months of careful restraint and patient hope finally broke open into pure joy. "I love you too," she whispered, "so much." When Ezra kissed her, it was with 3 years of stored-up tenderness, 3 years of believing he'd never feel this way again. It was a kiss that tasted of new beginnings and second chances, of bread fresh from the oven and spring rain on fertile soil. When they finally broke apart, they were both crying, tears of grief finally released, tears of joy finally allowed, tears of love finally acknowledged. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked, her forehead resting against his. "Now we figure it out together," Ezra said, echoing her words from weeks ago. "We keep baking bread, we keep building this business, we keep learning how to love each other." And Sarah, Ezra was quiet for a moment, looking out over the farm where he'd lived and loved and lost and found again. "Sarah gets to be part of our story," he said finally, "not as a ghost or a burden of guilt, but as the woman who taught me that love is worth the risk of losing it. She's the reason I know how to treasure what we have." As the sun set over the Miller farm, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Rebecca and Ezra sat together on the porch of the bakery, where they'd found their future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new loaves to bake, new dreams to build. But tonight, they had this. Two hearts that had been broken in different ways, now mended and joined together, stronger for having been tested. Inside the old farmhouse, Sarah's quilts still covered the beds, and her recipes still guided their cooking. But now there was room for new memories too, new traditions, new love, built on the foundation of what had come before. The past wasn't forgotten, it was honored, integrated, made part of something larger and more beautiful than either of them could have created alone. In the distance, the sound of evening birds filled the air, and the scent of fresh bread still lingered from the day's celebration. Rebecca curled into Ezra's arms, her head on his shoulder, and felt the deep contentment of a heart finally home. "Thank you," she whispered into the gathering dusk. "For what? For taking me in that night, for giving me a chance, for teaching me that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you starts with everything falling apart." Ezra pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Thank you for crashing into my oak tree, for refusing to give up, for showing me that healing doesn't mean forgetting, and that love multiplies rather than divides." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, two souls who had wandered lost in their separate wildernesses and found each other just when they needed it most. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, love never was, but they would walk it together, building their life one loaf, one day, one tender moment at a time. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the Pennsylvania hills, they would go to the bakery together and begin again, kneading dough with 4 hands instead of 2, tending the fire that warmed not just the oven but their hearts, creating something nourishing and beautiful and lasting in a world that too often settled for less. The bearded Amish farmer had hired a lost woman to bake, and she had indeed warmed his cold heart. But more than that, she had taught him that winter always gives way to spring, that broken things can be made whole, and that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with passion, but with patience, not with grand gestures, but with the simple, daily choice to care for each other's wounded hearts, until they're strong enough to beat as one. In the end, that was miracle enough for any two people brave enough to believe in second chances and stubborn enough to choose love over fear. And as they sat together under the vast Pennsylvania sky, Rebecca and Ezra knew they had found something worth every tear they'd shed to get there. A love that would last, not just for a season but for all the seasons to come.